January 14th, 1942. New Delhi, India. The night was still, but the air crackled with the invisible energy of a nation on the brink of change. In the heart of the colonial capital, a young woman sat at a small wooden desk. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic clacking of her typewriter. She had no formal education, no connections to the political elite, and yet she was about to become one of the most dangerous people in the empire. Her name was Savitribai Phule, and the words she typed would echo in the corridors of power, challenging the very foundation of British rule in India. Savitribai was not an obvious revolutionary. She was a woman, in a time and place where women were often relegated to the margins, their voices silenced by both tradition and imperial decree. She was also from a lower caste, part of the oppressed and disenfranchised classes the British had exploited for generations. Yet here she was, poised to use the empire's own tools to destroy it. The typewriter before her, a symbol of colonial power, of bureaucracy, of order, was about to become her weapon of resistance. In the sterile world of the British Raj, the typewriter was a tool of control. Documents were typed to enforce laws, to issue commands, to communicate orders from the seat of power in London to the distant corners of the empire. The act of typing, of transcribing these imperial edicts, was a small, seemingly insignificant task. But to Savitribai, it was an act of rebellion. The British had long underestimated the power of the written word. They believed they could control the narrative, shaping it to fit their image of superiority and civilizing mission. Yet in the quiet, dimly lit room where Savitribai worked, the words she typed were far from the pro-imperial propaganda that flooded the airwaves and newspapers. Her words told a different story. The story of a people oppressed, a culture being erased, and a legacy of resistance that the British had tried so hard to suppress. It was a contradiction that the empire could not see coming. Savitribai, a woman from the lowest rung of society, was using the very instruments of British imperialism to unravel their control. The empire had given her a typewriter, expecting her to be just another cog in the colonial machine. But she was something entirely different, a revolutionary disguised as a secretary. She typed furiously, her fingers flying across the keys as she poured her thoughts onto the page. The typewriter, which had been given to her as a tool of silence and order, was now a machine of resistance, a vehicle for truth. She wrote about the atrocities committed against her people, the exploitation of India's resources, the cultural erasure that the British had carried out for decades. She described the strength and resilience of the Indian people, painting a picture of a nation that would not be broken by imperial power. The paradox of her situation was staggering. Here she was, an illiterate woman, wielding a typewriter like a sword, taking on an empire that prided itself on its intellectual superiority and technological prowess. The British had assumed they could control the narrative of India's story, but Savitribai was rewriting it from the margins, turning the typewriter into a tool of subversion. She was speaking to the heart of the empire's greatest fear, the possibility that India would one day awaken and challenge British rule, not with guns or bombs, but with the power of words. But as the night wore on and the stack of typed pages grew higher, Savitribai knew that her actions would not go unnoticed. She had no illusions about the consequences of her rebellion. The British were not fools. They would eventually see what was happening. But that was the gamble she was willing to take. The typewritten word was too powerful, too dangerous for the empire to ignore. The more she wrote, the more she could sense the walls closing in around her. She had no idea when the British would strike, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they came for her. The empire's response would be swift, and it would be brutal. The British could not afford to let this rebellion grow. They would try to silence her, to erase her from the history of India's resistance. But Savitribai's words were already in the hands of many, passed from one person to the next in secret. She had planted the seed of rebellion, and there was no turning back. The British could imprison her, even kill her, but they could not erase the truth she had written. And in the shadows of British-occupied India, others were beginning to do the same. The typewriter, once a symbol of colonial control, had become a weapon of defiance, a rallying cry for those who refused to live under the boot of imperialism. But in those early days, as Savitribai typed into the night, she was not thinking about the revolution she was igniting. She was simply telling the truth, writing down the stories that needed to be told. She had no grand vision of overthrowing an empire, no lofty ideals of a new world order. She was a woman, a mother, a daughter, who had lived her life under the yoke of oppression. Her rebellion was not born out of ambition, but out of necessity, the need to speak, to be heard, to say what had been unsaid for too long. And so, with every keystroke, Savitribai Phule became more than just a writer. She became a symbol of resistance, of the power of the oppressed to challenge their oppressors, not with force, but with words. She had taken the empire's tools and turned them against it. In doing so, she had shown that no empire, no matter how powerful, could ever fully control the narrative. The story of India's liberation was being written in the most unlikely of places, a small room in New Delhi, with nothing but a typewriter and the courage to speak the truth. But the question remained, would the empire recognize the threat before it was too late? And when the British came for her, as they surely would anyone remember the woman who used a typewriter to change the course of history? The days that followed the first pamphlet were a blur of secrecy, urgency, and fear. Savitribai Phule continued her work, each word typed on the old machine, cutting deeper into the fabric of British rule. But with each sentence she composed, the empire's vigilance grew. The typewriter that had once been a tool of colonial bureaucracy had transformed into an instrument of resistance, its clacking keys now heralding the storm of defiance that would sweep across India. It was strange how quickly the whispers spread. The very act of printing and distributing her manifestos, small, simple pamphlets that could fit into the palm of one's hand, began to stir something in the people. The words, though quietly rebellious, were a spark in the tinderbox of colonial India. They were simple truths about the exploitation of the nation's resources, the degradation of its people, and the hollow promises of the British Empire. Savitribai knew that her words alone couldn't spark a revolution, but she also understood that no revolution ever began with violence. It began with a voice. She had not yet seen herself as a leader. She had not intended to become the face of resistance, but resistance was finding its face in her words. What began as quiet dissatisfaction with the oppressive colonial regime had turned into something more powerful, more organized, more deliberate. The pamphlets began to circulate through the underground networks, handed from hand to hand, hidden in the folds of clothing, tucked away in the cracks of walls. The British could not stop the spread of truth once it had taken root. And yet, for all the noise her words were making, Savitribai could hear the silence around her. Her small acts of rebellion were invisible to the world that needed to see them. The empire, though beginning to feel the tremors of change, remained indifferent to her presence. Her typewriter, the very tool she had used to expose its lies, had become nothing more than an unnoticed item in the colonial machinery. The British had not yet understood the depth of the threat she posed. But Savitribai knew that her writing, her words, had found their mark. In the darkness of the night, in secret meetings between the rebels and intellectuals of the time, her name was whispered. They had read her pamphlets. They had understood the significance of what she was doing. The written word was not only an act of resistance, it was an act of unity. She was showing people how to fight with their minds, how to use their intellects to challenge an empire that relied on their ignorance. Every night, Savitribai worked in secret. She would lock the door, sit by the window, and type. The room would be lit only by the flickering light of a single oil lamp. Her fingers would move quickly, pausing only when the sound of an approaching footstep outside made her heart race. She knew the British were closing in. There were whispers of raids, of crackdowns, of informants betraying the trust of the resistance. But still she typed one word after another, as though her life depended on it, which in many ways it did. In the darkness, she was no longer just Savitribai Phule. She was the embodiment of resistance, of courage against an empire that saw its subjects as nothing more than cogs in a machine. Her typewriter became the tool through which her revolution would unfold. The British could confiscate it, they could break it, but they could never break the truth that had already been set in motion. She knew the risks. She understood the consequences. But there was a fire within her, a determination that ran deeper than fear. She had come to realize that this was not just about her. It was about the millions who had been silenced, the generations that had been lost to the weight of colonial rule. Her words were giving them a voice that could no longer be ignored. The first time they came for her, she was ready. The night was no different from any other. She was sitting at her typewriter, a pile of freshly printed pamphlets beside her, when she heard the sharp rap at the door. Her heart froze. She quickly shoved the pamphlets into a drawer, hoping they wouldn't find them. The British officers barged in without warning, their boots clanging on the wooden floor. "Savitri, one of them growled. She stood slowly, her hands trembling, but her eyes never leaving his. She knew the question wasn't one of curiosity. It was a demand, a threat. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. "What do you want?" The officer's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the typewriter. He knew what he was looking for. He would take her, lock her away, and break her. They always did. But the British had underestimated the power of a woman who had nothing left to lose. They had underestimated the strength that came with speaking the truth, even if it meant facing imprisonment. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for the typewriter. Savitri stood still, not moving, her breath slow and controlled. She had always believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. This was her moment. She could feel it. Her resistance was no longer just words. It was something more, something deeper. The officer reached for the typewriter, but she stopped him. "You can take my typewriter," she said, "but you can never take my words." He didn't respond. He simply looked at her, a mixture of contempt and confusion in his eyes. He could see she wasn't going to break. And so, after a few long moments, he left, taking nothing but the knowledge that a woman with a typewriter was a more formidable opponent than he could have ever imagined. Savitri did not stop. The next day, the pamphlets began to circulate again as though nothing had happened. It was as though the empire had done nothing more than stoke the fires of rebellion. The British had tried to erase her, to silence her, but in doing so, they had made her even more dangerous. Savitri's revolution was not just about politics. It was about showing the world that resistance could be quiet, it could be subtle, it could be as simple as a woman and her typewriter. She had become more than a symbol. She had become a force. And in the quiet of the night, as the ink dried on her pamphlets, she knew that the empire's greatest fear was no longer a rebellion led by armies or generals. It was a rebellion led by a woman who dared to type the truth. The days after the raid were a strange mixture of clarity and confusion. Savitri had expected the backlash, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of erasure that followed. The British, despite their attempts to suppress her words and imprison her spirit, had underestimated one essential truth. You cannot silence the fire of a people's collective memory. Her pamphlets had spread far beyond her expectations, carried by hands that had nothing to lose, passed from one mouth to another, whispered in the dark. They had become more than just pages of defiance. They had become the spark of something deeper. But now, as the empire's iron grip tightened around India, the question lingered in the air. What would become of the woman who dared to speak the truth? For a while, Savitri continued her work in the shadows, writing, typing, sharing her message where she could. The underground resistance had only grown more organized, more insistent. But even as her words found their way into the hearts and minds of millions, they also began to disappear from the pages of history. In the official records of the British Raj, there was no mention of the young woman who had taken up a typewriter to challenge empire. To them, Savitri was an anomaly, a footnote in the grand narrative they were building to justify their control over India. There was no public recognition, no celebration of her courage. The empire had begun to erase her, not only from the present, but from the future as well. Her name was buried beneath the weight of 100 other stories, each more official, more palatable to the imperialists. To the British, she was an inconvenience, an unimportant figure in a much larger machine. But to the growing movement for independence, she was a symbol, an enduring figure whose courage had inspired a generation. Savitribai could have vanished into obscurity, just another martyr whose name was lost in the sands of time. But there were others who remembered. There were the men and women who had read her words, who had heard her message, who had seen the seeds of revolution in the lines she had written. She had become a ghost in the shadows, an inspiration that would not die, even though the empire tried its hardest to bury it. Her writings continued to circulate quietly through hidden pamphlets, underground meetings, and secret gatherings. In homes where the imperial gaze did not reach, her name was spoken with reverence. Her words became the backbone of a new movement, one that was not defined by its leaders or its armies, but by the ideas it carried, by the stories it told. And yet, as the struggle for independence gained momentum, there was something poignant in the way her role was often overlooked. The revolution was growing, but the woman who had sparked so much of it was being forgotten. Years passed, and the tides of history continued to shift. India's struggle for independence reached its zenith in 1947, when the British finally left, their empire unraveling in the face of an unstoppable wave of resistance. But even as the country celebrated its newfound freedom, Savitribai's name was barely spoken. The official histories of the Indian independence movement rarely mentioned her, if at all. There were new heroes now, men with loud voices, with political clout, with grand visions. But Savitribai had never sought the limelight. She had never wanted to be a figurehead, a celebrity, a leader. She had only wanted to speak the truth. As India celebrated its hard-won freedom, there were no statues erected in her honor. No grand speeches were made about the woman who had defied an empire with nothing but a typewriter and a fierce determination to speak out. Her role in the struggle for independence was not erased entirely. It was simply written in a way that did not give her the credit she deserved. The empire had faded, but the memory of the fight against it was reshaped to fit the narratives of the new leaders. And in this new narrative, Savitribai was not a central figure. She was a forgotten footnote, a woman whose revolution had been drowned out by louder voices. But history, as always, is complicated. There were pockets of people who remembered her, who carried the memory of her words with them, quietly passing them down through the generations. Savitribai became a ghost in the annals of history, a whisper in the wind, a name that would occasionally rise to the surface, only to be buried once more beneath the weight of time. Her typewriter had long since been discarded, its keys worn and faded, but the ideas it had helped bring into the world were not so easily forgotten. In the years that followed, Savitribai Phule's story would be rediscovered, at first by scholars, then by activists, and finally by a new generation of people seeking to understand the complexities of their history. Her writings would resurface in archives, tucked away in forgotten corners of libraries, preserved by the very system that had tried to silence her. The irony was not lost on anyone. The British Empire had tried to erase Savitribai, to wipe her from history, but in doing so, they had immortalized her. Her message, once thought to be contained within the walls of the empire, had now burst beyond them. And yet, even with this rediscovery, there was something bittersweet in the way her legacy was reflected. In the grand narrative of India's struggle for independence, she was often relegated to the margins, her contributions minimized, her voice muted. Her typewriter had broken the empire, but the empire had succeeded in breaking her recognition. Savitribai Phule had been erased, not by the British, but by the very people she had fought for. The truth of her story, though powerful, had been lost in the overwhelming noise of history.